In 1934, Brighton in the south of England was rocked by two murders. The first came to light in June, when a torso was found in a trunk at Brighton railway station. The second was found at 52 Kemp Street, not far from the station. On 17th June, William Joseph Vinicum noticed an unclaimed plywood trunk at the left luggage office at the railway station. Why it caught his attention was the smell emanating from it. Instead of opening it himself, he called the police. Chief Inspector Robert Donaldson arrived and prized it open. Inside were the remains of a dismembered female torso. Following the grim discovery, other railway stations were alerted, and soon a report came in that something had been found at King's Cross railway station in London. A suitcase was emitting a horrible smell, and when opened, contained 2 legs. Nothing more of her body was ever found, and she was named in the press as the girl with the pretty feet, or simply Pretty Feet, as she was thought to be a dancer. Following a post-mortem, the surgeon, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, told the police he believed she was around 25 years old and was 5 months pregnant. The cause of death couldn't be determined, but the legs and feet did belong to the torso. She was well nourished and stood at 5 feet 2 inches tall, and she weighed roughly 8.5 stones at the time she was murdered. The perpetrator has never been found, although a named suspect was George Stratton, who was later named as the murderer of his wife Mamie Stewart in 1961, when her dismembered remains were found. Stewart had disappeared in 1919. Soon, police were alerted to the disappearance of 42-year-old Violet Kay or Saunders, who had vanished that summer. She'd been a dancer and a sex worker in London, where she'd met a man from Newcastle upon Tyne, going by the name of Tony Mancini, although he was actually Cecil Lewis England. He also used the aliases Jack Noiter, Hyman Gold, and Tony English. He was 26 and had a criminal record, but was working as a waiter at a London cafe when they met. Kay and Mancini moved to Brighton in September 1933, but they moved around the city, frequently changing addresses. This was at the behest of Kay, who refused to stay anywhere longer than 6 weeks. The couple's relationship was stormy. On 10th May 1934, the couple had argued at the Skylark Cafe in King's Road Arches where he worked. Kay, who'd been drunk at the time, openly accused him of being too familiar with Elizabeth Attrell, a teenage waitress at the cafe. Later that evening, a man named Kerslake visited Kay, but found her to be agitated, twitching, and she seemed scared, but he thought she seemed to be under the influence of drugs. This was the last time Kay was ever seen alive. The following day, Mancini explained her disappearance to friends, saying she'd gone to Paris, but he also gave away some of her clothing, a green suit, fawn hat and a coat, to the young waitress he'd been keen on, telling her she'd left them behind when she'd gone to Paris. Attrell noticed blood on one of his shirts, but he said he'd cut himself shaving, and she thought nothing more about it. Kay's sister, Olive Watts, who was supposed to be visiting on Monday 14th for a holiday, also received a telegram purporting to be from Kay, which stated she was going abroad, Good job. Sale Sunday. Will write. Vi. However, the telegram wasn't sent by Kay, as she was already dead by then. The time and date stamp was Friday 11th May at 8:50 a.m. and had been sent from the head post office in Brighton. Shortly after this, Mancini moved once more. This time he went to 52 Kemp Street, taking with him a wooden trunk, which he moved by handcart as it was so heavy. The property was close to the railway station. This trunk contained the body of Violet Kay. He placed the trunk at the foot of his bed and covered it with a cloth, and used it as a table. When friends visited, they noticed the smell and complained, but Mancini made excuses. Soon, bodily fluids seeped from the trunk. Having been told of the possible disappearance of Kay, Mancini was questioned by the police. Spooked, he then went on the run. But with his home so near the station, and so soon after the torso had been found, the police searched it on Sunday 15th July, where they found Kay's decomposing body in the large black trunk. A post-mortem was again carried out by Spilsbury, following her identification by her friend, Mrs. Phyllis Summers. They'd known one another for around 15 years, as both worked on the stage. Meanwhile, a manhunt got underway for Mancini, and he was arrested in southeast London. He was charged with Kay's murder on 17th July. The trial got underway on 11th December 1934 at the Lewis Assizes and lasted 5 days. The presiding judge was Justice Sir George Arthur Arwin Branson. James Dale Cassels, King's Counsel, led the prosecution case, while Norman Burkett defended Mancini. He pleaded not guilty to the charges. The post-mortem had found Kay had been hit on the head, and this had caused her death. The writing on the telegram sent to Kay's sister was also found to be Mancini's, as it had been compared to menus he'd written at the Skylark Cafe. Doris Saville, a witness in the case, told the court he'd asked her to give him a false alibi, while John James Cochrane, a former attendant at the Aladdin Cafe in Brighton, stated he'd been boasting in the days following her disappearance that he'd given Kay a hiding. He told him he'd just had a dust-up with that prostitute of a missus of mine. I've given her the biggest hiding she's ever had in her life. Frederick Samuel Coftry also added that he'd said he'd bashed her from pillar to post. It was also alleged he'd said, "Why knock women about with your hands? You only hurt yourself. Hit them with a hammer and slosh her out the same as I did." Mancini's defence was that he'd discovered her body at their previous home, a flat at 44 Park Crescent, and he believed the police wouldn't believe him, with him having a criminal record, so he'd panicked. He'd purchased a trunk from a Mr. Wood at a market in Brighton, telling him he was going to France. When he gave his testimony, he told the court he loved Kay right up until the day she died. His defence counsel, Burkett, claimed she could have been murdered by one of her clients or had fallen down the steps into the flat to her death. Burkett also brought up the question of forensic evidence. He queried the amount of morphine in Kay's blood and proved that clothes stained with her blood had in fact been bought after her death. On 14th December, after 2¼ hours of deliberation, the jury came back into the court and the foreman stood. Mancini was found not guilty of the murder of Kay, and the judge told him, "You are discharged." Finally, in 1976, Mancini admitted murdering Violet Kay. He and Kay had had a blazing row, and he claimed she'd attacked him with a hammer that he used to break the coal. They wrestled and he grabbed it. She then screamed at him to give her it, and he threw it at her, hitting her on her left temple. Although he'd perjured himself at the original trial, there was still not enough evidence for the prosecution to take him to court, as there was a lack of corroboration. Mancini had got away with murder.